Well, I'm excited to be able to speak tonight about Margaret Ray Williamson Hall. And she is Wilma's great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, and Ruby's great-great-great-great-grandmother. So we're excited to speak about her. She was born January 25th, 1844 in Stirlingshire, Scotland, to James Williamson and Mary Ray. And that's a picture of her parents right there. This is a picture of Margaret when she was in her younger years. Margaret's father and grandfather by trade were colliers, and I didn't know what a collier was, so I had to, can you hear me? Okay. I had to look that up, and collier is a British word for coal miner. So that's what her family was. Margaret grew up there in Stirlingshire, and there isn't a picture of her home, but there is pictures of the homes in that area. So this is called Miners Row, and this is what it looked like for Margaret as she was growing up. Coal mining was a dangerous and strenuous and dirty job. The average life expectancy of a collier from Scotland back then was 27 years old. Anyone who made it to the age of 50 was called a phenomenon and would most likely be emaciated and breathless if they made it to that age. One writer wrote of that area, "Everywhere there are constantly clouds of smoke, the glare of furnaces, and all the clatter of rolling mills, foundries, and works for the manufacture of different kinds of machinery. There is no worse place out of hell than that neighborhood. At night, the groups of blast furnaces on all sides might be imagined to be blazing volcanoes, at most of which smelting is continued on Sundays and weekdays, day and night, without intermission." So it was a pretty hard place to grow up in. So in 1843, when missionaries Peter Moffat and Matthew Carruthers taught the family about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, they must have rejoiced about a promised land and the opportunity to go to America. In 1843, Margaret's parents were baptized and confirmed, and 5 years later in 1848, they were ready to start their journey to Zion. The family set sail on February 20th, 1848 from Liverpool, England, with 120 other saints on the ship Carnatic, under the direction of Franklin D. Richards. They arrived in New Orleans, Louisiana on April 20th of that same year. Margaret and her family arrived in St. Louis, Missouri 4 days before Christmas in 1848 and stayed there for 2 years, saving money for their trip out west. In the spring of 1851, the family finally had enough money to begin their trek. They were part of the Scotch 10, or Scotch Independent Company, that was traveling across the plains. Now, something interesting is David Stoddard, one of the prominent families here in town, the Stoddard family, was also traveling with the Scotch 10, and David Stoddard married Margaret's oldest sister, Mary. So kind of a connection there. Upon the family's arrival in Salt Lake in the fall of 1851, Margaret was 7 years old, and Brigham Young called many of the Scotch saints with mining expertise to settle Parowan, where an ironworks was going to be established. Since Margaret's father was an experienced miner, that's where the family was called. Margaret's childhood was the epitome of pioneer life. She survived extreme drought conditions in southern Utah, grasshoppers eating all her family's garden foods, the Walker Indian War, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, of which her father witnessed because he was a part of the Nauvoo Legion. In 1858, Brigham Young closed the Parowan Ironworks down, and Margaret's family, after hearing how wonderful Cache Valley was, decided to move to Cache Valley, to the little place of Wellsville, in the spring of 1809. So that year, here came the Williamsons. And here's a picture of where they camped, where they settled in Cedar City. At this point in the story, Margaret is 15 years old, and her family moved into Mons Fort for protection until they could build a cabin of their own. The family lived in their wagon box, because at this time Margaret's mother was very sick, and so Margaret had to pick up a lot of the chores. A few years later, on February 2nd, 1864, Margaret married Samuel Parley Hall, who was 3 years older than her. Their first home was located where Lewis and Alta Brenchley's house is currently. Does everybody know where that is? About 2 blocks exactly down this road. So, Samuel and Margaret had 10 children, and Wilma and I are descended from their son Thomas. Five short years after her marriage, her father James, who had been a miner all of his life, passed away here in Wellsville due to asthma-related illness. He was 56 years old. So, statistically speaking, he was a phenomenon. Sometime during the marriage of Samuel and Margaret, Samuel became disillusioned with the church. He was upset about the teachings or the people who were running the church. And at that time, the Edmunds Act was happening, and that was against polygamy. That was outlawing polygamy. So the sheriffs and the marshals and all of the law enforcement in the valley would come here, and they would solicit help from Samuel because he didn't like people practicing polygamy. And he would tell them, hey, so-and-so over there, they're practicing polygamists, go and arrest them. Well, Margaret, she stayed true to the faith, and she was kind of tricky. She would listen to what Samuel would tell the police, and then she would tell one of her children to sneak out the back door, run over to so-and-so's house, and say, hey, you better get up to the hills, the sheriff's after you. So they escaped. And that, I don't know if Samuel ever figured it out, but that's what was happening. Another story about Margaret that's special is when they were building the Logan Temple, the church asked for extra donations, anything that could help financially with the exterior or the interior of the temple. And Margaret, not having a lot of money or worldly possessions, she donated one of her cows to help fund the temple building. She passed away on April 19th, 1891, at the age of 47 due to bleeding of the lungs, which today we know is tuberculosis. 8 of her 10 children made it to adulthood, and I am very proud to call myself one of her descendants.